My baby dolls, we're back again. Another episode of Genesis. This time we are detouring from baseball a little bit, and we're going into the world of classical boxing. We got a great show in store for you folks today. We got Jeffrey Sussman here with me today on his wonderful book, which I think everyone should read. Baer and Barney Ross, Jewish Heroes of Boxing. We're going to get to a little bit about the book, and we'll get to a little bit about Jeffrey, and then we'll bring Jeff on to the show. This is a fantastic book. I know boxing has not been, stellar in society as it was back then or even 20 years ago. In fact, last time I really watched boxing was when Lennox Lewis was champion in the late 90s, early 2000s. You are, of course, listening to Genesis. It is under the productions of the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man himself, Ralph Tycho. And as always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz. Marc Weiss is on assignment in Arizona during spring training. But again, this is a show that I think everyone should listen to, even though it's not baseball, football, or one of the major sports, because boxing was a major sport prior to, say, 1950. For the first half century, it was baseball and boxing, and we'll get into a little bit about that history. But here, culturally, I think, it's more than just a boxing book. I think Peter Wood, who was the author of Confessions of a Fighter and A Clenched Fist, The Making of a Golden Glove Champion, said it best in the review of this book. This book is a fascinating glimpse of the first half of the 20th century, the golden age of Jewish boxing. Max Baer and Barney Ross, Jewish Heroes of Boxing, is a gem of a story, packed with fascinating revelations and amusing anecdotes, yet the subject here is far greater than boxing or the ferocity and valor of both Baer and Ross. It is an intelligent and gripping glimpse back into the Depression, the mob, Hollywood, and World War II, the forces and influences that led to a time when boxing was indeed a Jewish sport. And I bet you folks didn't know that, because I didn't know that. But I knew who Max Baer was because he had a son on the Beverly Hills Billies, and of course I wasn't born yet. I was born in 1970, but I knew. I saw it in syndication, so I knew who Max Baer Jr. was. But this is a fantastic book. Jeffrey Sussman, he's the author of 10 nonfiction books, as well as numerous articles and short stories about boxing. He's a regular writer for the premier boxing website, www.boxing.com. I think he also wrote articles for The Ring, but we'll get to asking him that question in about a few minutes. Sussman is the president of a public relations and marketing firm based in New York City. And if you are interested in that, you can go to www.powerpublicity.com. And without any further ado, welcome to the show, Jeffrey.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it's been a heck of a pleasure. First of all, I hope I didn't butcher you with my opening, but you've done a lot of things, and I think you did write for The Ring, didn't you?
No, that I didn't do. I would like to, but I haven't done that. I'm sorry to say.
Well, I thought you wrote articles from. But anyway, how long did this research take to put this
writing and
book?
The writing and the research altogether took about 12 months.
So about a year. All right.
Yeah.
Now, you were writing articles on, and then you got the idea to put this into a book.
I had been writing a lot of articles for boxing.com, and based upon my own personal experiences with my father and his introduction of boxing to me when I was a young teenager, gave me the idea finally of writing this book. My father had attended the fight between Max Baer and Hitler's favorite boxer Max Schmeling in Yankee Stadium in 1933, and told me how important that was to the Jewish community in New York at that time, because they were so angry at the rise of Nazism and the pervasive antisemitism that was going on at that time. And when Max Baer took off his robe after he entered the ring and they saw a Jewish star stitched onto his boxing trunks, everyone began to applaud and some cheered and whistled. And then when Baer won the fight in the 10th round, he was beating Schmeling so badly in the 10th round that the referee had to stop the fight. Otherwise, Baer would have killed Schmeling. But when Baer was announced the winner, he said all the Jews in the stand just stood up and cheered. They were so happy that they had a hero.
Now, there's two things about that fight. We'll get to the fight a little later on because that's pretty much, the cream of the crop. When he fought Schmeling, what was that, 33, 34? I think.
1933, right.
Yeah, I forget. I remember reading it. Two things that came out of it, which I did not know, which your book wonderfully portrays. I think Max Baer got a circumcision before the fight.
No, that was a rumor that was going around. I don't know if it's true or not.
Well, what the hell would you get circumcised for? You're a grown man. Must have heard it was an instant. And the fact that that's great. I love it. Can you imagine? I know somebody. When I was back in law school, someone married a Jewish woman and got a circumcision back in Virginia, probably in the 1990s. And they had a blackout as they were ready to snip them. So they had to literally stop on the operating table with the forceps on. So I'm like, oh my God, that must have been painful. And also, at Yankee Stadium, about half the crowd, which was about 60,000, I think, were Jews.
Right. Yeah, that's what my father said. And he said that, there were a lot of representatives from the German-American Bund there, which was a pro-Nazi group. And they were cheering wildly for Schmeling. And when Schmeling lost, the gloom on that side of the stadium was palpable. He said they were so disappointed to see their hero take a beating from a Jewish boxer.
And the time period is very, very important. But even before I get into the time period, because I do want to talk about anti-Semitism and how even your book says that Schmeling was German, but he didn't embrace Nazis. But what I want to get into...
Not at all.
Yeah, no, he didn't. And, Hitler threw him into the parachute division so he get killed. I think he invaded Greece. He was on the Greek.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
He was in Greece and tried to get killed. But he lived to 99 years old, I think, Schmeling. He lived a long life.
And he was really quite a decent man. And Hitler demanded that he fire his Jewish manager, Joe Jacobs. Schmeling refused, and that took a lot of guts to stand up to Hitler and refuse to do that.
Yeah, and the fact that Hitler, again, 33 basically is when I don't know if you want to say seized power, bullied. He was made chancellor. I think Hindenburg was president at the time, but he was too old to really, he was really too old to challenge Hitler. And even this is before Kristallnacht and all the other stuff, even before he took over the Rhineland, which was a violation of the Versailles Treaty, even to allow Schmeling to cross the Atlantic before and after the Berlin Olympics in '36, to me signifies that Hitler had a strong belief in Schmeling, and that Schmeling was a guiding principle to the Aryan race, at least in Hitler's mind.
That you're absolutely right. There's no question.
I think that. But now this is very interesting. When you told the story of when you were a little boy, you were a skinny kid, and
that's right.
It reminds me of growing up in Brooklyn and short. That, you're going to get picked on, you're going to get bullied. I want you to explain that story because that's how you got your interest in boxing.
Yeah, so my father grew up in a tough immigrant neighborhood in the 1920s and early 1930s, and he died when he was a young man of cancer. He was only 46, but I went to visit his only surviving brother in Florida, who was 90, to learn more about my father. And he told me that every day after school, in high school, my father got into a fist fight with some kid who was an anti-Semite because in the neighborhood that they lived in, it was primarily German immigrants in a section of Queens called Richmond Hill. And my father learned to fight. And one of his close friends growing up was a very big guy named Abe Simon. And he and my father belonged to a Jewish social club. And one Saturday night, there were 4 kids outside this Jewish social club where the kids were having a dance. And they were shouting anti-Semitic slurs and threatening them and demanding that they come outside and fight. And I think one of the kids standing outside had a baseball bat or some sort of club. And Abe Simon, who by the time he was a senior in high school, was 6'4" and weighed about 230 pounds, went out there and he immediately knocked out 2 of these kids. The third one was bigger and a little tougher, and he got into a fist fight with Abe, and Abe knocked him out eventually, and the fourth one ran off. And I heard this story from my father, and so when I was I think 12 or 13, and as you said, I was short and skinny. My father, who was concerned that I would be picked on, came home one day with a pair of boxing gloves, a speed bag, a heavy bag, a jump rope, and he set it up in the basement of our house. And he taught me the elements of boxing. And after he taught me the elements of boxing, he said, I'm going to sign you up for 10 lessons at Stillman's Gym, which was the premier boxing gym in New York, maybe in the country at that time. Most of the great heavyweight fighters of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s trained at Stillman's Gym, which was on 49th Street and 8th Avenue. And my father knew Lou Stillman, the owner of the gym, and he paid him $100 to let me have 10 boxing lessons there. And there was a middleweight whose last name I can't remember, whose first name was Nick. He was an Italian middleweight who gave me 10 lessons. You know, he taught me to jab, how to deliver a right cross, how to feint, how to weave and duck, and most of the techniques that one would need as a boxer. But by the end of the 10th lesson, this went to my head, and I had an oversized image of myself, and I said to Nick, I'd like to get into the ring and spar with someone. And he said to me, "Kid, you're crazy. You get into the ring with someone and you're going to get killed." And that ended my training at Stillman's Gym. But when I left, I in the process of leaving, I went to my locker there to change into my street clothes, and someone had put in a Stillman's T-shirt for me to wear, and I think I wore that every day until the T-shirt finally fell apart. But it was a wonderful experience being at Stillman's Gym and seeing many of these old legendary boxers from the 1940s and 50s who would often go there to watch the new fighters who were coming up and to watch them spar and train. When I was there on 2 different occasions, I saw the 2 Rockies, Rocky Marciano and Rocky Graziano, and it was fun. It was exciting to see these people, and from that experience, I developed a love of boxing.
Oh, that's fantastic, and I think Abe went on to play in a couple of movies. On the Waterfront, which is probably one of the most famous movies of the 1950s.
Sure.
Marlon Brando, and Requiem for a Heavyweight, Never Love a Stranger.
Right.
Love it. Yeah, I mean, so, you know, Simon, but let me ask you this. Your grandfather also told you about Benny Leonard. And let's get into Benny a little bit, because these are all the prerequisites before we even get into Max Baer and Barney Ross.
Well, you know, my grandfather was an immigrant from Russia, and when he came to this country, he settled on the Lower East Side, and he had strange interests. He initially he wanted to be an artist, and he loved opera, but he also liked boxing. And he thought boxing was an important way to defend yourself, because he had grown up in Russia and saw these terrible pogroms where Cossacks were beating the crap out of Jews and Jewish kids. And he joined a gym on the Lower East Side called the Fondor Gym. and that was where Benny Leonard trained. And he didn't, get to know Benny, but he would watch Benny train, and he could see what a terrific fighter he was, how skillful he was. And Benny, who grew up on the Lower East Side, whose real name was Benjamin Leiner, often had been picked on by big kids, and he learned how to defend himself and become a skillful boxer, and no one would pick on him anymore. And he was considered the first of the scientific fighters. In other words, he would understand what the strategy and tactics of his opponents were, and then model his own defense and offense to meet those tactics and strategies of his opponent, and he would defeat them. He was terrific. It was said that he was so good at defending himself and so good at avoiding being hurt that at the end of the fight he didn't have one hair on his head that was out of place. and that he could have left a fight and gone out and posed as a haberdasher's model. He looked so good after a fight, not so much as a bruise or a welt on his face.
A lot of people don't know about the Tsar and the pogroms that were in Russia. But if anyone wants to, look into it, I would suggest looking at Fiddler on the Roof, because those are examples, and probably small examples, of what the Cossacks and the Tsar did, especially during the Jewish wedding, and how they were going to take over the town, and the Jews had to leave because that kind of fight was going on for centuries. Since Poland, since even before Catherine the Great, she threw most of the Jews into Poland, and then they migrated back. And anti-Semitism was pretty prevalent even before the rise of it again after the 1890s, especially in France in the Dreyfus case. But also you have Abe Attell, which is another great story in itself.
Yeah, I just want to add to what you just said about the pogroms.
Yes.
My grandfather grew up on the Russian-Lithuanian border, and his father was a rabbi. And one day the Cossacks came, and this was during a pogrom. I think it was around 1905. And my great-grandfather went out to plead with them not to hurt the Jews in the community. And instead they tied him to a post, they poured kerosene on him and set him on fire.
Yeah,
killed him.
That's awful.
And it was because of that incident that my grandfather left Russia. He was only 15 at the time, and he made his way to Bremerhaven, Germany. And because he wanted to be an artist, he was very good at sketching portraits of people. And he sketched portraits of people in Bremerhaven and earned enough money to pay for passage to the United States, and that's how he arrived on the Lower East Side.
Yeah, a lot of people have a lot of luck. A lot of my family came from the St. Petersburg area in Austria, and they were able to get out in the early 1900s because what awaited them, of course, was the fate of World War One. Lithuania was right in the middle, and so was Austria. And of course, if you survived that, you probably would have been liquidated in World War II in a camp somewhere.
Absolutely.
So when you see the end of Fiddler on the Roof, I'm going to Chicago, I'm going to New York, I'm going here, I'm going to Boston. But the kids, one of them goes to Siberia, another one moves to Poland, and you have to wonder, because that's 1905 Russia in the middle of the Ural Mountains. If those people would have survived the Second World War, I think the toll on Russia was probably just as great as China. 25 million people were vanquished during the war. But let's talk about Abe Attell, because I like that story as well.
Abe was one of 10 children, born and raised in San Francisco, a very poor family. The father had abandoned the family. Mother took in a wash and was a seamstress to make ends meet. Abe started fighting one day. His mother had put out some sheets that had just been laundered and hung them outside to dry. and a neighborhood kid was pulling the sheets down and trying to throw them into the mud. And Abe went after this kid and started fighting with him and beating him. And his mother ran out of the house and separated the two boys. I think Abe was 12 at the time. And as soon as she got Abe inside, she warned him not to fight anymore. But as soon as she turned her back, he ran outside and got the kid again, and launched into another fight with the kid. And his mother had to pull him off again. But Abe realized at that age that he really enjoyed fighting, and he it was somewhat of a delinquent, and his mother. He was running with a gang of young tough kids in San Francisco, and his mother was worried about the way he would wind up, and so she sent him to live with an uncle in Los Angeles who tried to straighten Abe out, but it really didn't work. I think he lived with his uncle for about a year, and then his uncle threw up his hands and sent little Abe back to his mother in San Francisco. And there was a combination restaurant and bar in the neighborhood, and if a kid and they would have amateur fights in the center of the restaurant, and if a kid won, I think he got $5, and if he knocked out his opponent, he got $10. And there was a young bully in the neighborhood who made fun of Abe, and Abe challenged this kid for a fight at the bar, and much to everyone's surprise, Abe walloped the kid and became a sort of the local champion of this bar and of the kids. And Abe went on to train to become a fighter, and he was he was very light. He was a featherweight. He was a skinny little guy, but as tough as all get out. And initially, his mother was very against his going to the fights, but when she saw how much money he could earn and he could save her from having to do this onerous work that she was doing, and he earned enough money to put food on the table for all of his siblings, she became a big fan of his, and she would attend his fights, and she would always take an umbrella with her, and she would sit almost ringside, and if anyone said anything bad or booed her son, she would hit the person over the head with her umbrella. And Abe had two brothers who tried to follow in his footsteps and become boxers, but they weren't as good as Abe was. And from 1906 to 1912, he was the world champion in his weight class. He took on all comers, and he had more than 100 fights, and he was phenomenal. He had a very colorful career. After he left boxing, he became a friend of a man named Arnold Rothstein, who fixed the 1919 World Series, and Abe was his bagman. He was the one who paid off the Chicago team baseball players to throw the game. And when he was indicted and tried for this, he was able to convince the jury that he was the wrong Abe Attell. They were looking for a different Abe Attell rather than him. And he had a tremendous chutzpah, and he was cleared or acquitted because he convinced the jury that he was the wrong Abe Attell. He went on.
My God.
He went on to have a successful one of the early sports bars and restaurants in Manhattan. He married, and I think he died in the early 1970s. So he had a nice long life. I had a friend who was a doctor, whose father was a professional gambler who controlled gambling in New York for famous mob guy Frank Costello. And because of Abe's connection with Arnold Rothstein and the fixing of the World Series and gambling and so forth, my friend's father was a close friend of Abe Attell, and I this friend took me to lunch one day at an Italian restaurant on Arthur Avenue in the Bronx called Amelia's, and he told me about his meeting Abe Attell when he was a young boy, and what a fun-loving and kind of charming guy he was. Though he said that his nose must have been broken 3 or 4 times in his fights because he had one of the funniest-looking noses he had ever seen.
and Jeff, during this time, of course, a lot of people listening to the show don't know about the anti-Semitism in the United States. You know, we're starting to see dribs and drabs on the news with the Jewish cemeteries, and the news is detailing stuff that, you know, really hits to the heart of a source of problems that wasn't only in Europe, but it was right here in the United States during the time. I want you to talk about, you mentioned 3 figures, and I want you to talk about the anti-Semitism at the time when all of these boxes, were coming up.
Well, it was a terrible time for Jews in the United States. I mean, if you were Jewish and you wanted to get ahead, you wanted to be hired by a corporation, you often had to change your name and disguise the fact that you were Jewish. I had an uncle who worked for a company called John Mansfield for 30 years and hid the fact that he was Jewish because he believed that had his managers known that he was Jewish, he either would have been fired or he probably wouldn't have been hired in the first place. But probably the 3 biggest proponents of anti-Semitism during that period were a Catholic priest named Father Charles Coughlin, who had one of the most popular radio shows on during the 1930s, in which he said that the only people who wanted war with Germany were Roosevelt and the communists and the Jews, and he would go after the Jews all the time in these talks, and he would refer to President Roosevelt as President Rosenfeld, claiming that he was really Jewish and had changed his name in order to enter politics. And he had something like 30 million listeners every week. And finally, he became such an embarrassment to the Catholic Church that they yanked him off the air. Another, of course, was Henry Ford, who published a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent, and on the front page of every issue of the Dearborn Independent was a feature called The International Jew, and he railed against the Jews. And when asked once what he thought of baseball, he said the problem with baseball is there are too many Jews. And he was ultimately sued by a Jewish labor organizer named Aaron Shapiro for slander and defamation, and the case dragged on, and it was postponed and dragged on and was postponed, and Shapiro eventually won the case, but he didn't want any money. He just wanted a public apology from Henry Ford, and he wanted him to cease publishing the anti-Semitic columns he was writing. Ford had his lawyers draw up an apology, which he refused to read or announce publicly, but he let his lawyers disseminate it to the press. But he refused to allow himself to be quoted directly apologizing to Jews. And he is the only American listed and praised in Hitler's Mein Kampf. And Hitler had kept a photograph of Henry Ford on his desk. And he said that after reading Henry Ford's articles, The International Jew, that Henry Ford had the right idea about how Jews ought to be treated in the United States. And Joseph Goebbels had all of Henry Ford's articles put together into a 2-volume compilation of books, and they became the second most popular books in Nazi Germany after Mein Kampf, and were required reading by all high school students, along with Mein Kampf, of course. So the third proponent of anti-Semitism in the United States was that great hero of aviation, Charles Lindbergh, who praised the Germans and had a position that was similar to Charles Coughlin, in that he said the only people who wanted war with Germany were the British, the communists, and the Jews. And he said if the Jews keep angling for war, they're going to get it in the neck by the American people. And Charles Lindbergh's wife, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, was so upset about the things he was saying that she said, you know, you're just going to rally all the anti-Semites to your cause, and now you're going to be pictured as an anti-Semite, and that's not something you want to do. He refused to listen to her, and he delivered a really vicious, nasty speech called the Des Moines speech, in which he railed against the Jews. And after reading it, Franklin Roosevelt said to his Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, he said to him, he didn't understand what had happened to this kind of nice all-American boy, but after reading his speech, he said it could have been written by Joseph Goebbels. It was so bad.
Goebbels, of course, Goebbels was the public relations, speaker for the Reich in Germany. But let me just ask this: in your research, excuse me, did you pick up upon the rise of the Ku Klux Klan after the movie The Birth of Nation? Because when that happened, the Ku Klux Klan changed radically from just being hell bent on barring, minorities such as colored people, as in their words, or outsiders. They were also, their signs they carried in the March of Washington were no kikes, which is with a K, no Catholics with a K, and no coons, which were, of course, African Americans. Did you pick up on any of that during your research?
I knew about it, but I didn't put it into the book, because I was really just focused on what was going on primarily in the 1930s, and I think that march took place in the 1920s, didn't it?
It did. It did, 1925. But that led up to the whole thing. I think it heightened in World War I. I know General Grant. The first instances was under General Order Number 11, where during the Civil War, Grant issued the order, which was quickly, rescinded by President Lincoln, to expulsion against Jews from the portions of Tennessee, Kentucky, and Mississippi under his control. So that was the first, and then World War I came, and then you had the whole 20s, and then the 30s again. What people don't understand is that times were bad. We have the depression here. Terrible. Everybody was out of work. So, communists, Nazi parties, you got to blame someone. And the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, I believe, spilled over a lot in the United States. Much of it is not spoken about. But I think the three examples that you used in Lindbergh, Ford, and Father Coughlin, it's not even Coughlin, it's Coughlin, right?
I think so, yeah. Charles Coughlin.
Yeah, because I saw your video of your talk you had, and you said Coughlin. Those things, and especially with the media, the radio, were able to showcase this anti-Semitic spews in everyone's house, just as they would listen to Roosevelt in a fireside chat. So, you did have that kind of anti-Semitism that goes on. Now, let me ask you about the early upbringing of Max Baer. We'll start with Baer first.
Baer, his father was Jewish, and he grew up on a ranch in Northern California. And Baer was actually a very pacific man. He did whatever he could as a teenager to avoid getting into fights. He didn't like it. And he worked very, very hard on his father's ranch, did a lot of physical work, and he developed an extremely muscular body so that, all the neighbors thought that he had taken a Charles Atlas course in weightlifting and bodybuilding. And he, as his son, Max Baer Jr. said to me during an interview, he said, my dad got paid 35 cents a night from his father to slop pigs, which meant that Max Baer had to go around to restaurants at 3 o'clock in the morning, collect their garbage, bring it back to the ranch, and feed it to the pigs that his father raised on the ranch. But one night, this was during Prohibition, Max and a number of his friends went to a local dance. And outside the dance, they saw a pickup truck, which belonged to a lumberjack. And in the back of the pickup truck was a large jug of wine. And the boys thought it would be a lot of fun to drink the wine. And Max and about 4 other of his friends consumed all the wine in this jug. And the lumberjack spotted them, and he was a big, husky guy. And he took out after them, and the boys started running. And Max was at the back of the pack of boys running away. And the lumberjack caught him by his shirt collar and spun him around and punched him on the face. It didn't seem to faze Max. He just looked startled. But instinctively, he reared back with his right arm and let fly with a right fist, and he knocked out the lumberjack, and the man remained unconscious for about 5 minutes. Well, a boxing promoter saw this and said to Max, have you ever thought of being a boxer? And Max said, no, I hadn't, but my mother is a big fan of Jack Dempsey, so I know about boxing. And but before I would do it, I'd have to ask my mother, and he asked the boxing promoter how much he would get paid, and he said you'd get $35 a bout, and if you had a bout a week, you'd make $140 in a month, which is a lot more than you're getting now at slopping pigs. And Max Baer was entranced by the idea. He went home and spoke to his mother, who said, "Great, I think it's a great idea. You should become a boxer." And so he went and he signed up with a promoter named Ansel Hoffman. And one of his first fight for a championship, it was called the Pacific Coast Championship, was against a boxer named Frankie Campbell. And that wasn't his real name. His real name was Francesco Camilli. He was the brother of the famous baseball player Dolph Camilli. But there was a certain amount of anti-Italian prejudice in that part of California because a lot of Italian immigrants had settled and worked on the waterfront there, and the locals didn't particularly like them. So Francesco changed his name to Frankie Campbell because he thought it would be better received by the local populace. And during the fight, Frankie Campbell's cornermen were yelling insults at Max Baer, really trying to get his goat, and he became angrier and angrier as these insults were hurled at him. And he took it out on Frankie Campbell and beat him pretty badly. And as a result, Frankie Campbell died from that. Max went with him to the hospital and cried like a baby over the fact that he had killed this guy. He felt so badly about it that he didn't fight for the next 6 months. He couldn't bring himself to box. And then when he did return to boxing, for the subsequent 6 bouts he had, he gave all the money that he won from those bouts to Frankie Campbell's widow. Much later in his life, when Max became a rich and successful man, he paid for Frankie Campbell's kids to go to college. So he was a very decent, a very conscience-driven man who was totally misrepresented, I felt, as did Max Baer Jr. in the movie Cinderella Man, where he was made to look like a loutish, boorish bully who had no feelings for other people at all, when the exact opposite was the case. He was a very kind, very generous, very thoughtful man. And when he came to New York, he got the kind of publicity that one would associate with Muhammad Ali. He went out with chorus girls and actresses and dancers and models, and he was reported on in all the gossip columns. And when it came time for him to fight Max Schmeling at Yankee Stadium, and Max didn't know anything about Nazism or the rise of Hitler, and Ansel Hoffman told him that Max Schmeling represented the Nazis, and the Nazis would like to get rid of people like you and your father and anyone who has a Jewish connection. Well, that so angered Max Baer that he went. If you look on YouTube at the fight beginning in round one, he went after Max Baer with such ferocity that Max Baer was completely taken aback. He didn't know how to deal with it. And Max Schmeling was considered the finest heavyweight boxer in all of Europe. And by the 10th round, Max Baer was just about killing Max Schmeling, and the referee had to step in and stop the fight. Otherwise, Baer probably would have killed him. When it came time for Max Baer to fight for the heavyweight championship, he fought probably the largest heavyweight fighter of all time, a man named Primo Carnera, who was either 6'7" or 6'8", depending on which record books you look at. But Primo Carnera was controlled by the mob, particularly an Irish gangster named Oni Madden. And they had fixed all of Primo Carnera's fights up until then. And Primo Carnera had started out as a circus strongman. He really wasn't a boxer, though he learned boxing after a while, but he was never a very good boxer. And Max Baer knocked him down 11 times in I think in 10 rounds, and he badly hurt Primo Carnera. He broke his jaw, he broke a rib, and I think he broke a bone in his arm. But the mob that controlled Primo Carnera was so disgusted that he lost the fight that they said to hell with him, and they abandoned him. They had also stolen all of his money. And so Primo Carnera was in the hospital, and the mob had abandoned him, and they refused to pay his hospital bills. So Max Baer stepped in and paid for all of Primo Carnera's hospital bills after having beaten him for the heavyweight championship of the world. Now, when Max Baer died, Primo Carnera was in Italy. This was in the 1950s. And Primo couldn't be in California for Max Baer's funeral, but he flew back the following week. And he had his driver take him to the cemetery where Max Baer was buried. And the gates of the cemetery were locked. And so Primo Carnera and his driver had to climb over the gates of the cemetery. And they finally found Max Baer's grave. And Primo Carnera knelt at the grave, crossed himself, and said a prayer, and then said to his driver, Max Baer was the best friend in boxing I ever had. So it just goes to show the kind of generosity that Max Baer had and the affection that he engendered in the people that he encountered in the ring. As his son said to me, he had nothing but respect for everyone he ever fought, because he felt that in order to get into the ring and fight, you needed a lot of courage, and you had to respect someone who had that kind of courage. There was only one boxer he personally detested, and that was a guy named 2-ton tough Tony Galento, who was a kind of big fat street fighting kind of character who was known as a dirty fighter. He would gouge people in the eyes. He would use the laces on his gloves to scratch someone's face. He would try to even knee people in the groin while fighting. He was a very bad guy. But Max Baer was really quite a wonderful human being, and 5,000 people showed up at his funeral, and all of his pallbearers had been former heavyweight boxers who just adored him. Hello? Hello? Where should I start from?
Yeah, you can start from Primo, coming to visit Max Baer.
Okay, so Primo Carnera was in Italy when Max Baer died and couldn't attend the funeral. And the following week, he flew to Los Angeles and had a driver take him to the cemetery where Max Baer was buried. And the cemetery was closed. It was at night, and he and his driver climbed over the gate of the cemetery. They found Max's grave. Primo Carnera knelt at the grave site, crossed himself, and said a prayer, and then said to his driver that Max Baer was the best friend he ever had in boxing, which showed the kind of affection that Max Baer elicited from all of his opponents. They really liked the man. He was kind. He was generous to them, and had a lot of respect for them, and they respected him. As Max Baer Jr. said to me, he said that my father felt that anyone who got into the ring had a lot of courage, and he always admired the people and respected those who he fought against. And if you notice, he said at the end of his fights, win or lose, he always went over to his opponent and hugged him.
And when we speak of this, I think we're missing one fight with Eric Scharf, I think.
Eric Schaff, yeah.
Yeah, he ended up dying too, but in a different fight. But from those two fights between Frankie Campbell and Eric Schaff and Ernie Schaff,
Ernie Schaff, right?
Yeah, do you think that Max Baer always held back for the fear of killing someone?
Yes, he did, and there were a number of fights, especially after he lost the championship, where he was really concerned that he might kill somebody. And there were two fights that he lost late in his career where he was winning, and he could have finished off his opponent, but then he held back because he was nervous that if he finished off his opponent, he would actually kill that opponent.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very unfortunate thing to happen to Max. Let's get into Barney Ross, a much different story than
absolutely
these two. Let's hear about Barney.
Barney was originally born on the Lower East Side of New York, and his father was a rabbi who couldn't make a living, and moved the family to a Jewish ghetto in Chicago called the Maxwell Street Ghetto, where his father opened a very tiny grocery store. And one day, two hold-up men came into the grocery store, and they shot Barney's father and killed him. Incidentally, Barney's original name was Dov Beryl Borovsky, and he used that name until he became a professional boxer. He was his father had wanted him to to follow in his footsteps and become a Talmudic scholar. But after he saw what happened to his father, he lost all interest in religion and never went back to Hebrew school again. Though interestingly enough, he always said the prayer of the dead for his father, the Kaddish. And he began running with a local street gang in Chicago, what you would think of as, the typical juvenile delinquents of the time, fighting and stealing and getting into trouble and menacing the neighborhood and so forth. And his closest friend in this gang, a kid with a really hair-trigger temper, who was named Jacob Rubenstein. We know him better today as Jack Ruby, the man who assassinated or killed, you would say, Lee Harvey Oswald, the assassin of President Kennedy. But both boys, Jack and Barney, worked for Al Capone. They were runners for his bookie joints, and Al took an interest in them and thought that Jack Ruby had the makings of a mob guy, but thought that Barney did not. He knew that Barney was a skillful fighter because he had heard about a lot of Barney's street fights and how well he did in them, and suggested to Barney that he become a professional boxer. And Barney told Al that after his father was killed, his mother had a nervous breakdown and went into a mental institution, and his 3 siblings were farmed out to foster homes. And Barney wanted to earn enough money to reunite his family, to buy a house and have his mother and his 3 siblings back there. And Al said, well, if you do well at boxing, you'll be able to do that in a very short order. And Al arranged for Barney to have a very good trainer who trained him to be a very successful fighter. And then when Barney started fighting professionally under the name of Barney Ross, Al made sure that all the tickets for Barney's fights were sold, because Barney would get a portion of the proceeds from those tickets. And sure enough, he was able to buy a house and reunite his family. Barney had a trilogy of fights in the 1930s with a man named Jimmy McLarnin, who was known as the Jew Killer, because he had defeated 6 Jewish boxers prior to his fight with his trilogy of fights with Barney Ross. And when Barney and Jimmy McLarnin signed to fight each other, the Jewish community was hoping that Barney would finally destroy Jimmy McLarnin and put an end to the career of this so-called Jew killer. And in their first fight, Barney in fact won, and became a hero to Jewish communities throughout the United States. In their second fight, Barney lost on points to Jimmy McLarnin. And then they had their third fight here in New York, and Barney won that fight. But Jimmy McLarnin, who really wasn't an anti-Semite, he understood that the promoters were promoting him as an anti-Semite, and in order to generate a lot of excitement. He didn't like that. He wasn't happy about that. But his manager, Pop Foster, I suspect, was a little bit of an anti-Semite, because after the third fight, Pop Foster went to court to get the decision of the fight judges overthrown or tossed out. And his reason was that one of the judges in the fight was Jewish, and that Jack Dempsey, who was the referee of the fight, had a Jewish grandmother, and therefore they were disposed to award the fight to Barney Ross. Well, the judge thought this was a ridiculous contention, and he laughed it out of court. And poor Pop Foster had wasted $10,000 or so on this legal battle, which brought him nothing. And Barney Ross ultimately lost. He was the first fighter to hold 3 championship titles simultaneously: welterweight, super lightweight, and lightweight. There would be others after him, but he was the first one to do that. He lost his title eventually to a really superb prize fighter named Henry Armstrong, who was the inspiration for another great fighter, Sugar Ray Robinson. But after Barney retired from fighting, he opened a bar and restaurant in Chicago, which became a hangout for sports writers and athletes and mob guys and newspaper columnists. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941, Barney Ross tried to enlist with the Marines. He was, I think, 32 years old at the time. And they told him he was too old, that they wouldn't take him. But because of his political connections, Barney was able to have that decision reversed, and he was accepted into the Marines. And during his training period in the Marines, he was referred to as Grandpa because he was so much older than the other recruits. Eventually, he was sent to Guadalcanal, and one night out on patrol with 3 other Marines, they were ambushed by a platoon of Japanese soldiers. 2 of his Marine colleagues were killed immediately. The third one was badly wounded, and Barney tossed him into a ditch and then jumped on top of him. And in answer to the Japanese ongoing attack, he fired all the rifles that they had, going through all the ammunition. And then when he had exhausted all the ammunition, he began tossing hand grenades. Throughout the night, he tossed about 24 hand grenades. It turned out by dawn, he had completely destroyed the Japanese attackers. There were over 20 of them, and he had killed all of them. He was badly wounded. He didn't realize it during the night that he was also badly wounded. He had been wounded in the thigh and one foot. And he, even though he weighed only 145 pounds at the time, he managed to carry his wounded colleague, who weighed about 190 pounds, back to their camp, where they both collapsed. And Barney was taken to a hospital where he underwent a series of surgeries. And to deal with the pain that he was enduring, the doctors gave him shots of morphine a couple of times a day for days on end. The result of that was that Barney became a morphine addict. And by the time he got out of the hospital, he was addicted to it and spent all of his money on drug dealers for heroin. Nevertheless, right after the war, he was awarded the Silver Star in the Rose Garden of the White House by President Roosevelt. A number of people said that he should have gotten the Congressional Medal of Honor for his heroics, but they felt that they would go no higher than the Silver Star because he was Jewish, and they didn't want to give him the Congressional Medal of Honor. It's a debatable point. I don't know if it's true or not. But when Barney finally reached bottom due to his drug addiction, he was so disgusted with himself that he enrolled in a drug rehabilitation center run by the federal government in Lexington, Kentucky. And they told him that it would take a year for him to be completely cured. But he was so determined to beat this that he did it in 6 months. And when he got out of the drug rehab center, he spent the rest of his life lecturing college and high school students about the dangers of drugs. He died a fairly young man in his 50s of esophageal cancer. And there were 2 movies about him. One was a fictionalized version starring John Garfield called Body and Soul, and the other one was more about his having beaten drug addiction. It was called Monkey on My Back and starred Cameron Mitchell. The first one came out in the 1940s. The second one came out in the early 1950s. But Barney Ross's style of fighting was based on Benny Leonard. He had also this kind of scientific way of fighting, and until his fight with Henry Armstrong, he very rarely got hurt in the ring. And even in his last fight with Henry Armstrong, where he was getting so badly beaten, he refused to fall down. He could have fallen down, and that would have been the end of the fight. But he said, as a Jew, I refuse to fall down. I'm going to stand up until they have to carry me out of here. And he said when he left the ring after that fight, the audience was completely quiet. There was no cheering for the winner. He said all of a sudden he realized how much respect his fans had for him, that they were stunned into silence by his own heroic ability to withstand this brutal attack that he accepted. So, both he and Max were extraordinary human beings, and they were terrific examples to the Jewish community of heroism and of standing up to anti-Semitism.
And, excuse me, you know, Jeff, both of them have great stories, and believe me, I'm recommending this book to everyone out there to go buy, because again, there's so much more to learn about these guys than just, having a discussion on it for an hour. This book tells a lot about the culture, about both these men. I just want to say one last thing. Both these guys died very young. Max Baer, I think, became a referee, and he had a heart attack while refereeing a fight, and he died, I think, right in the ring. And of course, Ross over here, he had esophageal cancer, but he fought a terrible, and you described the drug addiction, really, really eye-opening to read all that material. Besides Amazon, where can we get this book?
Well, it's on Amazon.com and on BarnesandNoble.com and other retail online booksellers.
And you are working on another book. I'd like you to share what you're working on, and hopefully when you publish it, when are you going to be publishing your next book?
I think it'll be coming out in October or November. It's a book about Rocky Graziano, probably one of the most colorful middleweight fighters of all times, and the subject of a wonderful autobiography and movie called Somebody Up There Likes Me,
which we spoke about before the show. I want you to send me the book. I want you to come back on the show. If you want to come back even before then, we'll talk about boxing since I'd say the mid-'90s and early 2000s, and why the sport isn't as popular as we have seen in the first 50 years. I would even go further than that. Even in the time of Ali, well into the 80s, even when my world of sports, boxing was still a commodity. Now,
oh, sure.
Welterweight, middleweight. I mean, I used to watch Hagler and Hearns go at it, or Sugar Ray Leonard, and all these guys, Mike Tyson, and I remember the fight in Tokyo when he lost to Buster Douglas in 1990. That was huge.
Sure.
And
sure.
Now you don't hear anything.
No, fighting is falling, or boxing rather, has fallen on hard times. There's no question about it. And the people who are the primary boxers today, they don't seem to have the kind of charisma that excited people. The last great charismatic fighter, I guess, was Muhammad Ali.
Yeah, and you know what I think is taken away, and I could be wrong, the whole mixed martial arts thing, the what is that, the UFC or the UTC? I don't even know what the heck it is. They got it on Channel 4, the mixed martial arts with kickboxing
right.
and all that. I think that's become more of a popular fix to people rather than turning on or doing the pay-per-view to see a fight like I used to do. To see the fight, George Foreman wins at 45 years old, becomes heavyweight champion of the world. Huge.
Sure.
Mike Tyson's ear gets, Mike Tyson bites off Holyfield's ear. Huge. I remember watching on TV saying, "What the heck just happened?" I mean, and I remember, I remember being, I think, maybe 11 years old, maybe 10, when Ali fought Ken Norton.
Oh, sure.
And I think he got really beaten up real badly. Ali, he was well past his prime. He stayed in, I think, a little too long.
Yeah, everyone said that. I mean, that helped to bring on his Parkinson's disease. A lot of doctors feel.
Yeah, I mean, You watched the fight with Ali, with George Foreman, the Rumble in the Jungle. Now, of course, I was only 4 years old, but I've seen the documentary probably about 20 years ago, and even 20 years ago, like, wow, man, look at Ali, how he played to the camera, and you had Howard Cosell always with him, and he loved being in Africa, and he just played the part and showed how important boxing was. And I think that your book captures that spirit in the early 20th century. And it's been a pleasure having you on the show. I hope you had a good time.
I had a wonderful time, and I look forward to doing the show again, and I appreciate your interest in my book.
Oh, absolutely. You're fantastic. Hold the line, Jeff. This is how I end the show. Folks, I hope you had a great time listening to Jeffrey. Early boxing. Go out, buy his books. He has more books written besides just Max Baer. Very, very smooth writer, I have to say. Enjoyed his books. Really, really, really excellent reads. I'm Ian Kahanowitz, in for Marc Weiss. And we had a great show with Jeffrey Sussman. And in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks, and good luck.